So, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry you don't have everyone here, but in the sake of time, let's start. So, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm very happy to be in this session because we have three papers that address policy issues on the credit market. So, I think it's very important that we start in our country and everywhere, actually, to have more evidence-based policy. So these papers have very important discussions. So let's start with Gustavo and government banks and interventions in credit markets.
Is it on? Yeah. All right, so first, I'm Gustavo from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So it's a pleasure to be here, so thanks a lot for the organizers. This is a joint work with Felipe Neto, who is now at the Bank of England, and with Renato from the central bank. I don't know if he's here today. So I want to thank both Renato and the central bank of Brazil, for all of the help and access with the data. So today I'm going to be talking about government banks and interventions in credit markets. And just before we start, it's a very disclaimer-heavy paper. It's not the views of the Fed, not the views of the Bank of England, and definitely not the views of the central bank. All right, so the main motivation of our paper is that credit markets are prone to government intervention, as we'll see kind of like in this section. And there's kind of like some upside of doing it. So you can either counterbalance information asymmetries, you can avoid credit crunches. I will see in one of the papers, you can try to limit banks' market power, but there's also a lot of downside of doing it. So you run the risk of misallocation, there's the risk of political capture, and as we've seen kind of like in the paper Professor Sufi presented on Wednesday, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail later, there's also kind of like macro consequences of these interventions. All right, so one particular type of intervention is the use of government banks to extend credit to firms and households. So the question we're going to ask is how this increasing credit supply by government banks affects financial and real outcomes. All right, so the setting for those of you that were here on Wednesday is going to be very similar to the one in the presentation of Professor Sufi, but we're going to kind of like tighten it a little bit, kind of like our window analysis. So it's this quasi-experiment in Brazil. So in March 2012, the government announced, and a little bit shortly after, implemented this policy where they wanted to increase credit at a lower rate for both households and small and medium enterprises. So as we try to argue in the paper, this is really like one shock that is going on. It's not motivated, for instance, by political concerns. And just to give you a sense of how big this is the state-owned banks that were accounted for like 38% of the credit market before the intervention, so it's pretty large macroeconomically. And in 2012, the outstanding credit, so like the total kind of like stock grew 30%, while for private banks, this was kind of like around 11%. So you can think of like approximately like this 20% difference, and I'm going to refer to it back in the presentation. And then by mid-2013, the macro conditions changed. There is some concern that the banks cannot really keep doing this. And we're going to see in the data that like this pace of increase slows. So we're really going to focus on this 2012 to 2013. And then by the end of 2013, we're going to see kind of like what happened in this analysis. And here we're going to focus solely on firms. So you saw on Wednesday the evidence on households, and here is going to be just small and medium enterprises. Right? So let me show you kind of like just a little bit of how this policy looks kind of like in the aggregate. So in the left-hand side, I'm plotting the like total amount of standing from both public and private banks. Public banks in here are those that are owned, state-owned. And you see kind of like after kind of like this policy is implemented, we see that the outstanding amount kind of like really diverges for both types of banks. And on the right-hand side here, I'm plotting just working capital loans, which is going to be the focus of our presentation. And you see that you also have like this divergence. So before the policy, they follow kind of like pretty similar trajectories. And after you see kind of like this massive increase. And you see overall like this 150 to 100 billion reais increase in overall loans, but like really this like 40, 50 billion reais increase in working capital. So this is a pretty substantial part of the policy, right? And just zooming in even more, kind of like using the central bank data, that was showing you the stock, and I want to give you a sense of like originations and the rates that firms are paying in this origination. So on the left-hand side, again, is public versus private. Public is the blue line, private is the yellow dashed line. Left-hand side is origination, so it's amounts. Right-hand side is interest rates, on working capital loans. And here we're focusing on working capital loans because that was the big kind of like that was the focus of the policy, and is where we see kind of like this big increase. So as we see kind of like in the plot, around kind of like right after the policy, we have like this big jump. So these government-owned banks didn't do a lot of working capital lending before, and it really jumped and kind of like settled up at this level. We don't see kind of like this immediate response, private banks in terms of quantity. We do see private banks responding in terms of interest rates, and I'll try to argue in the paper this is really like an effect of the policy. So I'll try to argue that these trends that we see here is an effect of the policy. But one thing that's important to highlight is that throughout this period, even though like the interest rates charged by private banks decreased, they're still kind of like higher and a lot higher than those that were charged both before and after the policy for public banks. So let me highlight a little bit kind of like what is the contribution of the paper. So one of them is that this is an exogenous credit increase. And while there's a long literature on credit supply, most of it focuses on either credit decreases or focuses on crisis episodes, which is very interesting to understand what's going on there, but also like mixes in the effects of the crisis, how are firms and banks affected by the crisis, with the credit supply by itself. So we tried to argue here that this is really like, this is the shock that is going on, like this credit shock coming from public banks. The other one that is very interesting in our setting, that this is macro relevant. As I argued, these banks are responsible for around 38% of lending before the policy, and you see like this 30% increase in their outstanding amount. So like this is really like macro relevant. And not only is this macro relevant, we're going to see how private banks are going to react, and we're going to kind of like we can have this play between what are public banks doing and what are private banks doing. Finally, this is really a good kind of like comprehensive data on both the credit registry and matched with employer-employee data. And I want to highlight the paper that we all saw kind of like on Wednesday. So this is really like in a similar moment using the similar increase. Their focus is on households and a subsequent recession that followed in 2014. And we saw the excellent presentation on Wednesday. In here, our contribution is going to be, we're going to be looking at firms, and really we're going to be thinking throughout the boom. So throughout this credit increase, what is going on? Who is getting the money? Is this affecting like firms' employment, et cetera? All right, so let's start kind of like with the paper. So our first regression and our first result is going to be what happened with kind of like lending rates after the policy, right? So for that, what we're going to do is at the loan level, we're going to look for each loan, we're going to compute the rate of the loan, and then we're going to ask, is this loan originated by a private or a public bank? And we're going to have a set of kind of like fixed effects. In here, there's going to be time, region, sector. We're also going to have firm bank. If you're very interested in the appendix, you also have like the firm time to have the Quadjamian effect. But in really, we're really kind of like trying to see, is that decrease that we see that I showed you in the aggregate plot really coming from kind of like the policy? So if we account for firm characteristics, if we account for bank characteristics, do we still see kind of like that decrease? And the answer is yes. So you see, after we account for these controls, before the intervention, we have a pretty similar kind of like trend in interest rates. And after, we see this decrease in interest rates from private banks. All right, so this decrease is around kind of like 5 percentage points. This accounts for 17 to 20% of the pre-policy difference. So this is a pretty substantial effect that by increasing this credit supply from public banks at very low rates, kind of like private banks react by reducing the rates. It doesn't close the gap, but they do kind of like react. So it is effective in that sense. The second thing we can look at is then, all right, this is reducing rates. What is happening with quantities? And in here, we're going to kind of like we're going to revert this, and our dummy is going to be kind of like for a public borrower. So we're going to have a similar set of fixed effects, and our dependent variable is going to be debt over payroll. So we want to think about that, but relative to some measure of firm size. Unfortunately, we don't have, we can't merge a good measure of firm size in terms of like capital, equity, et cetera. So in here, the one that we have that is good is payroll. So we're going to look at payroll before the policy, and we're going to see what happens with that over pre-policy payroll to get a sense of kind of like around firm size. And what I'm showing you in here is the effect for exclusive borrowers from public banks versus the exclusive borrowers from private banks. So there's no firms in here that borrow from both banks. It's just private versus public clients. The dummies that you see are those from public borrowers. And as you see, like there's this big increase in debt over payroll for these clients, kind of like that from public banks. And again, this is what we saw kind of like in the aggregate plot, but this really kind of like accounts for firm, et cetera, bank characteristics. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude, this coefficient of 1 in here represents a kind of like a 20%, 27% increase in the debt over payroll for these firms relative to their sample average. So it's pretty large, and it's pretty consistent with the macro evidence we find. So this really like gives us confidence that what we're looking here is really kind of like this credit supply shock. So far we have that private banks react by reducing rates, but not by increasing the amount. So it's kind of like it's a mixed bag of what's going on the private bank side. And one kind of like supernatural question that we can ask is, fine, this is looking at these exclusive borrowers, but now what we're going to do is we're going to look at what is going on with those that are not exclusive borrowers. So our control group in here is going to be those that are only borrowing from private banks. Our treatment is going to be those that borrow from both banks. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you, and it should have the captions, I'm sorry, on the left-hand side, I'm showing you all debt to payroll for this firm. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing you just the debt over payroll for private credit, right? So private credit is coming on from private banks. So what we see in this plot is for non-exclusive borrowers, on the left-hand side, we see that they're being affected and they're increasing their credit. It's a little bit less in terms of magnitude than the exclusive borrowers, but it's still like it's pretty significant. On the right-hand side, and again, I'm sorry about the captions, I'm showing what is happening with debt from private banks for these firms, and what we see is this substitution effect. So we see that one thing that the policy is doing like this crowd out. These firms that borrow from both types of banks, they reduce their borrowing from private banks, and they increase their borrowing from public banks. The net effect that we still see like this large increase in debt for kind of like for these firms. All right, so this is interest rates and quantity. And then the next thing we're going to think about is, all right, so we saw what happens. So what does, what can we infer about what is going on in the policy? And for that, we're going to look at default. And default is particularly important because it's going to tell us something about information asymmetry and kind of like screening. So what is going on? So we saw that the firms are getting more credit. It's cheaper from private banks, but what's like, who are these firms and what can we infer from this? Right? So if you write down a model where it has kind of like information asymmetry between banks and firms, if the public banks have lower rates, you would typically expect it to have lower default, both from a moral hazard and adverse selection. So this is kind of like what we're going to have in mind. They have lower rates in the level. So even though private banks are reducing, still like the level of the rates from public banks is still pretty low. So we should expect kind of like less default. On the other hand, you can also think that maybe public banks have a different screening system and they're going to be better or worse kind of like doing screening. And these are also going to affect default. So what we're going to do in here, and I'll show you later, we're going to compare kind of like borrowers that at the moment that they borrow, they already have some credit outstanding versus those that are new, meaning like those that the banks don't have a relationship. So it's going to be both levered and unlevered. And we also show like the same thing for old versus new clients. All right. So the first regression we're going to run is we're going to generate this variable that takes a loan that was originated in T and that follows this loan for like 12 months after. And then the timeline you see on the plot is the timeline that the loan was originated. And if the loan defaults in any moment in the 12-month window, we're going to say this loan was a default. And that's what we're showing in here. So we're comparing this for private and public banks. So as we see kind of like before, they follow pretty similar trends. But after the policy is implemented, we see kind of like that the default between the loans that are originated at the moment that is in the x-axis. It's not that they necessarily default at this moment. It's really when the loan was originated. They start to see kind of like this this divergence between the default of public and private banks. And in the end, this is kind of like this is pretty substantial, as we show in the paper. This effect it's very large relative to the average. So you can see that like for private banks, this stays around the same level that it was when the policy was introduced. For public banks, this becomes kind of like 4 percentage points higher. So it's a super large, effect. So this is not consistent with the story where there's a lot of information asymmetry playing a role in here. And then similarly, we can think about what is going on in terms of levered and unlevered borrowers. And the plot with old versus new is very similar. So we're defining a levered borrower in here, someone that at the moment that they borrow, already have some credit outstanding. And unlevered borrower, at the moment that they borrow, they don't have any credit outstanding. So they're not kind of like in the sample. All right, so what we're going to see is that all of the change in default is coming from this levered borrowers, right? So this is not that there is this difference in screening and these government banks are really bad in screening kind of like these new clients, but it's really that the difference is coming from these clients that they already had kind of like outstanding loans, right? And the reason why the plot on the left is very similar to the plot in here before is because most of the allocation during the policy went to the borrowers, to the firms that already had loans. So what I'm showing you in here is the share of originations that is going to this unlevered firms, so firms that don't have any credit outstanding, and you see that there's this big drop. So most of the money is going to firms that already had credit outstanding with these public banks. All right. So the next thing we're going to look at is then, all right, we see where the money went. We see that it went through these firms that are already levered. So what happened with employment? So then we're going to run a kind of like a usual kind of like employment regression. We have very good measures of employment and payroll. So what we're going to find is we do find some significant effects, but they're pretty tiny relative to the amount of the credit increase. So we find stuff that is on around kind of like 1% to 2% range. So we do find that giving money to firms, and this firm is borrowing more, it's increasing employment, but relative to the amount of money, right? So it's like 27% of their debt to payroll increase. This is pretty tiny, and we argue in the paper that this is tiny relative to the literature. All right, so this kind of like concludes my firm analysis, and then we say, all right, so we did this at the firm level, but this policy was pretty big, and there's kind of like other stuff going on. So we're gonna look at what's going on at the regional level. So when we do our firm analysis, we have like this region fixed effects. We're throwing out a lot of the effect of the policy and really just comparing firms that were public or not public borrowers. But now we're going to put this back in, and really we're going to do kind of like this regional analysis. So one thing, and I don't have time to really get into this, but I think it's very interesting for people that do banking research, is that we can look at the borrower location and the branch location in the Brazilian data. And what we find is that branch location really doesn't matter a lot on this policy. So it's not because a region has a branch from a public bank that is going to mean that it has a different exposure. We actually find that because the shock is so large and there's so much more lending at a cheaper rates, this really doesn't matter, right? So what we're going to use in here is we're going to use how much were firms in that area already borrowing from public banks. So it's not if there is a branch, it's really how much were these firms already kind of like dependent on public banks. So what we're going to find is that if the share of loans that already came from public banks before the policy was high, we see that there is this pretty big increase in credit, so of around 24% in 2012. So remember that the number I showed you kind of like in the aggregate in the projection is around 20%. So this is in line with what we see in the aggregate. We don't find kind of like some real effects in 2012. We do find them in 2013. It's important here that just to note again that we find this in 2013, like this 50% increase in the amount of credit, and we do find a significant effect on GDP and employment. But again, this is small relative to the size of the credit increase. So if you compare with the literature, this is around half, right? So there is like other empirical papers and theoretical models that kind of like try to predict what this elasticity should be. And would expect an effect that is twice the size relative to the literature that analyzes the effect of credit supply shocks during downturns, right? So one extra thing that I want to say before I conclude is that there's also like this interesting effect that comes out of our results, which is we do have an effect on employment. We do have this very large effect on payroll. It's much larger than the effect of employment, and this is coming from wages, right? So wages are growing in these markets. So this is kind of like giving evidence of this G effects. You put a lot of money in some markets, it's during a boom, so these firms are going to hire, et cetera, but there's really going to be this price effect locally that is going to be dispersed across firms, and then you see like that a lot of it is going to go through prices and not so much through GDP, employment, et cetera. All right? So that's it. So we studied this credit market intervention implemented by the Brazilian government. This is like this large and unexpected increase in the supply of credit. So the policy is successful in some dimensions, so reducing kind of like interest rates But we really don't see kind of like this increasing the supply from private banks. So we actually find evidence of the opposite. We find evidence of this crowding out. And we find kind of like this limited real effects. It's not that they don't exist, it's that they are smaller than what you would expect, given the amount of credit that was injected in the economy. And just to make the point clear again, we really kind of like show in this paper, which is something that I think it's interesting, is that branch presence is really different from exposure, and we think can be useful for other people that analyze kind of like banks and regional exposure, right? So that's it.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. Now let me invite Daniel Ramos to discuss the paper.
All right. First of all, thank you for having me and for having me to discuss this paper, which I find super interesting. So let me jump right in. Just as you just saw, sort of the motivation for this paper is that non-crisis interventions of governments in credit markets are ubiquitous. This happens in many countries, developed and developing countries. And we have very good evidence of what happens in crisis times, sort of what happens when government intervenes in credit markets when there's a crisis. But importantly, we have much less evidence on what happens outside of these episodes. And so essentially, this paper is going to bring in new evidence to try to think about what the effects of government interventions in credit markets are outside of these crisis episodes, which I think is very important. Now, from my perspective, this is a very important and sort of policy relevant question because, as I said, these sorts of interventions happen ubiquitously across the world. And this paper has comprehensive data, and they do a very careful empirical analysis to try to tease out the effects of these interventions. Let me summarize the paper and its contributions in one slide from my perspective. So essentially, they exploit this non-crisis related government credit program in Brazil to show the following. So the first one is sort of the credit effects, which I call the first stage. There's this large increase in government credit that actually impacts private banks. So there's this reduction of interest rates from private banks in treated markets. And now the second part of the paper tries to look at firm level effects and regional effects. So at the firm level, they find an increase in leverage and default of firms that borrow from these government banks. And they find some sort of small firm level employment effects. At the regional level, they interestingly find that there's sort of an increase in nominal GDP for treated municipalities, but there's sort of insignificant effects on employment and wage bill. So as I said, the contribution is to really look at the effects, both at the firm level, regional level, credit on these non-crisis related government interventions. So I'm gonna give two main comments. I come more from a trade spatial literature, so I think my comments are gonna be biased towards that. And then I'm gonna provide some smaller suggestions for the paper, in particular for the framing. So let me start by saying the first one, which is there's this tension in the paper as to how to square the fact that we find no effects at the firm level, or actually negative effects, but yet you find sort of positive and significant effects at the regional level. So I guess, right away from a regional perspective, you start wondering, how do I square these results? So just sort of from when I was thinking about how can we sort of tease out the effects, very simple accounting equation of GDP at the regional level, both from the expenditure side as well as from the income side. And you can start thinking about, okay, what could we be missing in the analysis such that we find positive effects at the regional level and yet no effects at the firm level. So the first one, which is one that is actually discussed in the paper a little bit, is GE effects. So it could be the case that there's firm-to-firm linkages, and so firms that are connected to these firms that are impacted by credit actually do better. It could also be the case that there's an increase in employment of untreated firms, such that we find no effects at the firm level and yet positive effects at the regional level. And so here I would just sort of encourage the authors to explore a little bit more sort of these G effects. Some potential ways of doing this is to explore the effects on other firms that are not treated by the policy per se. For example, I know that the Central Bank of Brazil has this firm-to-firm linkage data, and so through transactions of banks, and so perhaps you could use some of that. And so that would really sort of help the reader to understand what is going on with these discrepancies. The other important thing that I think is more sort of from the consumption side is, as we have seen in this conference, a similar intervention, if not during the same time, sort of also affected consumers, in particular consumer credit. And so here I think, one other potential explanation is that the fact that we see positive effects at the regional level comes not from firms, but rather from consumers. So these government programs give credit to consumers that allows them to consume more, and hence we see these effects on regional GDP, but not at the firm level. And so here, it would just be useful to sort of show using SCR data that there's no effects on consumer credit, or if there is, that would also be useful and interesting to try to square the results. One last sort of more minor point is that the main firm level sample does not include firms that appear in SCR, but don't appear in RISE. So these are kind of firms that get credit, but perhaps are informal on the employment side. And in the paper, they say that it accounts for around 15% of the total credit of the program. And so perhaps it could be the case that the fact that you're not including them in the sample is driving these discrepancies between the regional and the firm level effects, because you could still have effects on these firms. They could still start hiring employees, formal employees, and so you could see firm level effects for those firms, and also that could rationalize the regional effects. So I would just encourage the authors to run specification with these firms to sort of try to understand whether there's something along those lines. The other one, I think here, my trade background is going to show more. I think as a reader, after you read this paper, you kind of are left wondering, okay, how should we think about this intervention? There's sort of positive regional effects. There's also a decrease in private interest rates, which apparently was part of the motivation of the policy. And yet there's an increase in default for firms, and also sort of not a lot of employment effects. So how do we think about welfare? How do we think about whether this is good or bad? And I think there's some discussion of this in the paper, but without sort of a model, it's hard to really understand what these effects are. So my first point is that mapping regional effects to aggregates is kind of tricky. So they find this regional GDP elasticity of 0.07% of the program. And this is small if you compare it to the aggregate elasticity in the literature, as Gustavo was saying. In particular, there's this theoretical paper by Herreño that finds an aggregate elasticity of 0.2. But the problem is that there's a challenge in interpreting regional elasticities as aggregate elasticities without a model. And so there's this very nice paper by Beraja and authors that makes this point. And so I would push the authors to sort of either provide a model or think a little bit more about how to compare these elasticities. The other thing is, we need to balance the negative effects on the increase on firm level default and the positive regional effects. And there's these papers that show that the increase in firm level default might not lead to an increase in aggregate risk. And so perhaps this is not such a bad thing in the end. And finally, one potentially harder thing to think about, but one of the main motivations for this government intervention was to tackle market power from private banks. And so the paper actually shows that this actually worked. So private banks decreased their rates. And there's some literature that tries to think about whether government interventions in different markets, not only credit markets. So here I cite a paper about the milk market in Mexico. How does that affect private market power, and what are the effects on welfare for consumers? So I think that's a bit tricky, and I would push the authors to think a little bit more about that. So final suggestion, just build a guiding framework, if not a toy model that allows us to sort of think about the different effects, and that helps us rationalize the results. So I'm running out of time. There's a bunch of other sort of more minor comments that I'd be more than happy to chat about offline, but it's about sort of specifications and some measurement of variables. So to conclude, super nice paper, highly relevant question, big effort on data work, very careful empirical analysis. As I mentioned, would be useful to have a guiding framework to sort of square the micro and regional effects and to guide the welfare analysis. And also sort of, I would push the authors to think more about the discrepancies in terms of G effects, consumer credit, sample selection, and so on. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. Let's see, before Gustavo make his replies, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Just a quick question about these results on the firm level effects on employment. I was curious about what is the role of capital intensity, because you showed that credit is going to highly leveraged firms, perhaps operating at a larger capital scale. And since you are only observing the response of employment, which is small, but this could be because actually this is going to firms that are more responsive in terms of capital, that of course you cannot observe, but you can say something if you look at the heterogeneous effects across industries. That's the question.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes.
So it seems that at the same time of the policy that you're looking, another thing that was happening here is that the Crédito Direccionado, earmarked lending, pushed through private banks, increased a lot. There was a large expansion, no? So it was not on the form of working capital loans, but on other types of financing to firms. So clearly the firms might be, I am trying to think, how is that contaminating what you're doing? Because private banks, is not that the lending is remaining stable, no? They are also being shocked by this other program. And that might also explain why the results, like you won't see so much difference between real outcomes of firms banking with private versus public banks. Not sure, just to comment that.
One more.
I just wonder what your results could inform about the level and the type of competition that existed before the intervention between private and public banks, in particular in face of the result that you found that default increases more for private banks that diminish the rate. So maybe suggesting that the decrease is not so much sustainable over the long run. I don't know. Thank you.
We'll have the floor yours.
So thanks so much for the detailed discussion, and I think those are great points, and thanks everyone for the questions. So let me address some of those. So first, in terms of the difference between firm and regional, I do agree that there's more work to be done. I think that is a very interesting distinction, and we started looking into it, for instance, using the kind of like Mian, Sufi, Werner, kind of like JF, tradable versus non-tradable. Can we separate this stuff? And as you said, kind of like affected, non-affected firms. And you can also look like who is it. There's some challenges with the data, as you can imagine, but those are things that are in the to-do list. So it's nice to see that. I agree that it's very intriguing, and I do think it's kind of like it's a super important point. In terms of what is the role of kind of like market power in general, and then like what does this inform us about banking market power before? So as some of you know, like I have other paper with Renato as well, and Bernardo, who is a co-author in the next paper, that we look at kind of like the role of banking market power in Brazil, and we found it pretty substantial. It's a pretty concentrated market. Rates are very high. So what we think in here is that this is not really. It's tricky to think of this as kind of like it's a competition shock, in the sense that the behavior of the public banks is not a welfare kind of like it's not a profit maximizing behavior, and then it's tricky to figure out like the conduct of the private banks. But I think that what this tells us is that there is some space. There was some space to reduce the rates, as we saw in the data. But yeah, so I do think it's a pretty important channel in here. I think it is behind the motivation of the policy, and it is behind some of the results that we're finding, but it's really hard to say what does this actually mean, except that it does matter. It does matter a lot. So in terms of the other policies that are happening at the time, which I also think enter into like our regional effects. So yeah, this was pretty comprehensive. So before there was this change in monetary policy stance, as we saw, in Carlos' paper yesterday, there is the change in kind of like households, there is a change in a lot of it. So we hope that, and maybe it doesn't come, clear enough, but we hope that in our empirical analysis, the way that we're looking at this is, for instance, we're looking at the full, like how much debt there is outstanding for this firm that would take in account like other things, other types of debt, et cetera. So when we show like the origination plots, we're thinking working capital. When we show our debt results, that's really like accounting for outstanding debt for that firm. So even if there's other things happening for firms, this is kind of like it's going to be captured there, and we still see like this crowding out effect. All relative. So this is all relative to the ones that are exclusive, kind of like public borrowers, et cetera. But within this comparison, so within this set of firms, we are taking account of that, and then within this comparison, we can also like look at what is going on with employment effects. So the region of the data allows us to go kind of like further and kind of like dig into kind of like a little bit. And I would say that the extensiveness of the fixed effects, the comparison groups we use, those are taking care of kind of like a lot of it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all. Let's move to the second paper. Danielle, thank you.
All right, perfect. So again, thanks so much for having me, for having this paper. So I think it's a perfect segue after Gustavo's presentation. In this paper, we're going to be thinking more about how government interventions in credit markets affects sort of the spatial distribution of economic activity. And this is joint work with Bernardo Van Doornik, who's also at the Central Bank of Brazil and the BIS. And of course, the disclaimer applies, which is that the views expressed in this paper reflect our personal opinions. Okay. So the motivation for this paper is that, this shouldn't be something that I need to tell anybody from this audience, but financial access is deemed an important driver of growth. And based on this idea, governments across the world spend large amounts of resources subsidizing credit for firms in specific regions and sectors through mainly national development banks. The goal of these banks, in summary, is to promote local industrialization and to reduce spatial income inequality within countries. Now, these are massive policies. National development banks are present in more than 155 countries, and they hold 6.5% of global banking assets. And the outstanding loans as a share of GDP within countries, and this is data from 2012, in Brazil, it's 11.3% of BNDES, China, it's 12.4%, Germany is 15.5%. And so these banks are not only present in many countries, but also within countries, they are very important players. Now, there's an important debate related to these policies. On the one hand, policymakers argue that if you subsidize credit in particular regions, that's going to facilitate local investment, which might increase manufacturing employment and attract high-skilled workers into treated local labor markets. But on the other hand, some economists have been more skeptical about these interventions because of two main things. The first one is that it really depends on which sectors you were subsidizing on the long-term effects of local labor markets. And second, the aggregate effects of these interventions are ambiguous because on the one hand, you can be subsidizing one region and that's going to be taking away economic activity from another region just to benefit this region. And so in the aggregate, that could be actually detrimental. And so with that in mind, this paper is going to try to answer two main questions. The first one is going to be empirical in nature, which is going to be what are the local labor market effects of firm credit subsidies? And in particular, we're going to be focusing on two margins. We're going to be focusing on whether they promote manufacturing employment and whether they attract high-skilled workers into treated local labor markets. And the second part is going to require a model, and we're going to try to think about what are the aggregate effects of these policies. Are they actually good? Are they actually bad? What are the distributional consequences? Who's winning? Who's losing? So what are we going to be doing in this paper? The first part is going to be empirical in nature. And what we're going to do is we're going to provide causal evidence on the local labor market effects of firm credit subsidies. So to do so, what we're going to exploit is a subsidized credit place-based policy in Brazil through a geographic regression discontinuity design to tease out the long-term consequences of these subsidies. In a nutshell, what we find is that contrary to what policymakers tend to say, actually these municipalities become more agricultural and less skill-intensive over time. So this is kind of a little bit puzzling ex ante. And so the next part of the paper is going to be a theory part of the paper where we're going to provide a multi-sector dynamic spatial general equilibrium model where the main new element is that we're going to have dynamics and credit market frictions to try to both rationalize the empirical evidence as well as to think about welfare consequences. So the main ingredients in a nutshell are going to be sort of intra-regional trade, skill types, migration, physical capital accumulation, but importantly, credit market frictions through working capital constraints and a government that can subsidize credit differentially across locations and sectors to try to reduce these frictions. And importantly, we're going to connect the theory and empirics by disciplining model parameters matching the regression discontinuities results. And finally, I'm going to show you the results from some counterfactuals that thinks about the aggregate effects of credit policies related to both subsidies as well as the frictions themselves. And so in terms of subsidies, around 50% of credit is subsidized in Brazil. And so we're going to think about the effects of removing these subsidies. This is going to be what I'm going to be showing you today. And what I find is that in a nutshell, these subsidies actually increase inequality across locations. So these policies on average in Brazil are regressive across locations. They are more targeted towards urban regions as opposed to rural regions. But importantly, given the allocation across sectors, they decrease inequality within locations across skill types, high skill and low skill, because they are mostly targeting agricultural sector in poor locations. And not today, there's another counterfactual that thinks about frictions. And so there we think about what would be the effects of equalizing local bankruptcy court productivity based on sort of a literature that was spanned by Ponticelli et al. Thinking about bankruptcy courts. Okay. So let me jump right into the reduced form evidence. So the policy that we're going to be exploiting started in 1988, and the context in which this policy started was sort of large regional income disparities in Brazil that are present even until today between sort of the Northeast and the Southeast. So in 1988, the GDP per capita in the Northeast was 40% that in the Southeast. And so the government started using subsidized credit as a regional policy tool to try to tackle this spatial income inequality, in particular through one specific type of policy, which is called the constitutional funds. And so essentially, the new constitution in 1988 created these funds that essentially take 3% of yearly income taxes to then subsidize credit for firms that are located in lagging regions, and specifically in the Northeast, in the North mainly. So how are we going to tease out the effects of these policies on local labor markets? Well, we're going to exploit an interesting feature of this policy, which is that 50% of all subsidies have to go to a specific region called the semi-arid. So an interesting feature about this region, which we're plotting in this map here, is that originally the boundary of this region was defined based on average precipitation. So essentially, all municipalities within the Northeast that had less than or equal to 800 millimeters of rainfall per year were defined as being part of this region. And so what this is going to give us is it's going to give us sort of a regression discontinuity analysis where we're going to be comparing municipalities just across the boundary of semi-arido before and after the policy to try to tease out the long-term consequences of this policy. So the specification that we're going to be running is we're going to have outcomes Y at a municipality M, state S, time T. We're going to have municipality fixed effects, state fixed effects, and then we're going to have this dynamic regression to try to tease out parallel trends before the policy and also the long-term consequences. Within the brackets, we have the semi-arido dummy, semi-M, that's going to be the coefficient of interest. But importantly, we're going to be controlling for a flexible polynomial in latitude and longitude to really try to compare municipalities just across the boundary. And finally, we're going to have some time invariant covariates to control for specific things, such as distance to the coast, for example. Now, very quickly, one thing that you might be wondering is, this region was defined based on rainfall, so perhaps this is not a good control and treatment groups. So what we show in the paper is that if you run this regression with variables before the policy in 1980, essentially you don't find any significant differences just across the boundary for treated and controlled municipalities. You can run sort of for rainfall in particular, you find that the coefficient is negative, but not statistically significant because we're just comparing municipalities across the boundary, but also for the variables that we're going to be looking at in the main part of the analysis. All right, so what data are we going to be using? We're going to be combining firm level credit data from the credit registry. We're going to be combining, given that this policy started in 1988, we're going to try to look at the long-term consequences using the population census, which contains information on wages, sector, location, and scale. So we're going to use 4 waves of the population census. Also, given the fact that SCR is only available since 2003, we're going to use SBAN to sort of try to look at the longer effects of this policy, which gives us information at the municipality level since 1988 to 2020. And then for the model, we're going to be using regional accounts data that I'm not going to go into details, but I'm happy to chat more about. All right. So given the fact that it's a short presentation, I'm just going to walk you through the main results. Perhaps doing it through graphs is going to be easier. But first, we find that credit subsidies are actually going towards agriculture and not towards services and manufacturing in semi-arido. And that leads to a large increase in agricultural credit of around 50%. So this is the dynamic specification, where on the Y, sort of the dependent variable is the log of agricultural credit. And what you find is that there's this increase in credit in treated municipalities of around 50% that stays pretty much fixed over time. Now, in terms of real effects, what we find here, what we're showing here is the effects on manufacturing employment, on the share of workers that work in manufacturing. And so what you find is that treated municipalities see less workers in manufacturing over time, with the share decreasing on around 2 percentage points. And the flip side of that is that the share of workers in agriculture actually increases. So and it's actually 1-for-1. So the workers that stop working in manufacturing go to agriculture. Finally, these other 2 plots are going to be related to skill intensity. And so here what we have is the ratio of high skill to low skill workers, where high skill is defined as is usually in the literature, high school or more. And so what you find is that in the long run, treated municipalities become much less skill intensive. And interestingly, we find no effects on the wage premium, despite the fact that low-skilled workers became much more abundant in these markets. So that's kind of like the empirical part of the paper. The second part of the paper tries to think about, okay, what are the welfare consequences of all of this? I'm showing you some empirical results, but we don't have a clear way of measuring whether this is good or bad, who it's benefiting, who it's hurting. And so what we're going to do is we're going to build a model that's going to allow us to think about the welfare consequences of these policies. And just to give you a preview of how are we going to rationalize the reduced form evidence, what we're going to argue is that there's going to be heterogeneity in the degree of capital skill complementarity across sectors. So there's a long literature that argues that in manufacturing, there's capital high skill complementarity, which is that the marginal product of high skill workers increases more if you have an extra unit of capital in manufacturing. Think about a computer. But in agriculture, perhaps, you have capital low skill complementarity. So if you provide extra tools through credit that allows firms to invest in capital, then that might differentially benefit low skill workers as opposed to high skill workers. Okay, so the model is going to be a general model that's going to have sort of I regions, J sectors. There's going to be 3 types of agents. There's going to be workers that are going to be high skill and low skill, and there's going to be capitalists. So workers are going to be migrating across locations. They're going to be solving a dynamic migration problem. Capitalists are going to be fixed within locations, and they're going to be solving sort of a neoclassical growth model type problem by which they're going to choose how much to consume and invest to maximize their intertemporal utility. And for those of you who are familiar with this literature, you can think about this model as having a static block, which is essentially going to be an intra-regional trade model a la Caliendo Parro, where the new component is that we're going to assume that variety producers are going to face a working capital constraint. So in order to produce, you're going to need credit, and because you need to pay your inputs in advance, and the government is going to sort of be able to provide credit in different locations and sectors to try to reduce these working capital constraints. And then there's going to be on top of that a dynamic block in which workers are going to migrate across locations and capitalists are going to accumulate capital. So what's the contribution of this model? We're going to be combining both we're going to be thinking about the dynamic implications of credit interventions because of these capital accumulation factor. So essentially, if you have a model with credit market frictions and you have government subsidies in credit markets, then there's going to be interesting dynamic implications of policies. Okay, so given that this is a 20-minute presentation, I'm not going to show you any equations. I think one equation maybe. So I'm going to try to sort of give you the intuition of the model in diagrams. And so you can think about the model as this being one region. There's going to be workers, high-skilled and low-skilled workers that are going to be working for a firm. This firm is going to be producing a final good, an apple. There's going to be a capitalist within each location that is going to be accumulating capital and renting this capital to the firm. The firm is going to need it to produce. And then there's going to be input-output linkages. So there's going to be other firms that are going to be selling to firms. Say, if this firm is an agricultural firm, it's going to need products from manufacturing in order to produce this final good. Now, what's going to be the main new thing? Well, we're going to think that this firm, in order to produce, is going to need financing from a bank to satisfy these working capital constraints. So I need to pay my inputs in advance. I'm going to borrow from a bank in order to pay my inputs. And this borrowing is going to be heterogeneous across locations. And the cost of borrowing is going to be determined by this representative bank. Now, what's going to drive the heterogeneity in the cost of credit across locations in our model? What we're going to assume is that the cost of a bank of providing credit in a particular location is going to depend on how costly it is to monitor projects in that location. And the way we're going to sort of map it back is in thinking about productivity of local bankruptcy courts. And so what is the idea? If I'm a bank and I'm lending to a firm in a location where the bankruptcy court system is very inefficient, it takes very long to solve bankruptcy cases, well, I'm going to have to charge a higher rate to firms in these locations because of the fact that I know that if they default, it's going to take forever for me to recover my assets in the face of default. And so heterogeneity in the degree to which bankruptcy courts are productive across locations is going to drive heterogeneity in the cost of credit across locations. Now, you might be wondering, okay, this is all about government interventions. Where is the government entering? Well, the government is going to be taking from taxation from workers and capitalists, as in the actual policy, it's going to tax these workers to then subsidize credit for the firms directly. And so essentially, using whatever the government recovers in terms of taxes, it's going to actually be able to subsidize credit for firms in different locations and sectors. Now, this is a one region diagram. This is how the monster looks in multiple regions. So you're going to have, this is two regions, and the connection between these regions is going to be coming from trade flows across regions. So different regions are going to be trading different goods, and there's going to be migration flows across locations. So a worker can decide to move from Rio to the Northeast or vice versa, depending on the shocks. Perfect. So with the time that I have left, let me just describe sort of the counterfactuals that we do in the paper. As I said, today I'm going to show you one counterfactual. We have another counterfactual that I'm going to briefly discuss. This is the only equation that I was going to show. Essentially, in the model, this is the overall friction for credit. This Greek letter is bar kappa. I is allocation, J is a sector. And so the total cost of credit in allocation is going to depend on monitoring costs. This is going to be M, and the subsidies of the government, S. So there's frictions in orange, and there's subsidies in green. And so essentially what we do in the paper is we use SCR data, administrative data, to back out region sector spreads for both for sectors as long-weighted region sector spreads, and also for subsidies. So a nice thing about SCR is that it tells you for every given loan, what amount of that loan is subsidized by the government. And so we're going to use that information to back out the implied subsidies for sectors and regions in our model. So as we have seen in different presentations in this conference, credit spreads in Brazil are quite large. So in Japan, it's 0.7%. In the US, it's 3%. In Brazil, it's more around on the margin of 30%. And that's actually what we see in our data. So here, an observation is a mesoregion sector-year combination, the model is going to be done at the meso-region level just because of data constraints. And so what you find is that in some markets, for example, all loans are subsidized. In the median share of loans that are subsidized is around 10%. But then the average private rate can go from sort of, the median is 27 percentage points, but the maximum can go up to 60 percentage points in some locations and sectors. And subsidies, you also see a lot of heterogeneity. So the median is 1.7 percentage points, but the maximum is 42 percentage points in some locations and sectors. And so all of this is we're going to put into the model to try to think about the consequences of these policies. Now, I don't have time to really explain sort of these points, but it's very important. So once we back out subsidies, we can see what's the heterogeneity both across locations and sectors. And there's two very important things that we find. The first one is that once you measure all of the subsidies, not only to the Northeast, but to all of the regions in Brazil, it turns out that subsidies are regressive across locations. So most of the subsidies are going to more urban regions as opposed to rural regions. And the other important point is that within locations, the heterogeneity in terms of sectoral allocation of subsidies, we find that they tend to differentially go to agriculture in poorer locations in Brazil. And so this is going to be important because it's going to drive the counterfactual effects that we find in the model. So as I mentioned, there's sort of two potential policies to try to tackle these frictions. You can either subsidize credit given the frictions to try to sort of ameliorate conditions in particular locations and sectors. That's the policy that we're going to be studying today. The other potential thing that you can do is you can tackle frictions directly. In the paper, what we argue is that one way of doing this is to do bankruptcy court productivity reform. And the counterfactual that we look at there is what would happen in terms of welfare and spatial inequality if you were to equalize local bankruptcy court productivity across Brazil. Because actually what we find is that richer municipalities tend to have more productive bankruptcy courts in Brazil. And poor municipalities have sort of less well-functioning bankruptcy courts, and hence, this also tends to be regressive. If you equalize bankruptcy court productivity, there's actually a lot of flows, capital flows that go to poor locations, and that decreases spatial inequality across the country. But let me focus on the first one. What I'm going to show you is just one graph that summarizes the results. What we have here on the x-axis is the GDP per capita of a particular location at baseline. On the y-axis, we have the percent change in welfare, and we have high-skilled workers in red and blue, and low-skilled workers in blue. And there's two main things that you see in this graph. The first one is that both curves are upward sloped. And so what that means is that welfare, due to the subsidies, tends to increase differentially in richer locations. And that's why you see sort of places where GDP per capita at baseline was larger tend to benefit more from these subsidies. But importantly, within locations, what we find is that given the sectoral heterogeneity in the subsidies and the fact that they're going towards agriculture mostly, in poor locations, low-skilled workers tend to benefit differentially from these subsidies. So we find that due to the subsidies, GDP per capita increases actually from 0.24 to 0.26 points. And as I mentioned in the paper, we look at this other counterfactual in which we think about equalizing bankruptcy court productivity across locations. And actually, what we find is that this policy would be better in the sense that it would increase aggregate welfare in the country, but moreover, it would decrease spatial inequality, which is one of the objectives of the government with these policies. As I said, because poor locations tend to have less well-functioning bankruptcy courts. So with that, let me conclude. This paper does two main things. The first part of the paper empirically studies a place-based policy of credit on skill and sectoral composition on the local labor market level. In the paper, we show that there's a large increase in credit, and in the long run, that it leads to an increase in agricultural employment share and a decrease in skill composition in treated local labor markets. What we argue is that sectoral targeting, so the fact that most of the subsidies are going towards agriculture, as well as spatial equilibrium through trade and migration, explain the results. And then we build a dynamic spatial general equilibrium model that allows us to rationalize and study the aggregate effects of these policies. So as I said, the subsidies tend to increase aggregate welfare, but they tend to be regressive. They benefit richer places at baseline, but in poorer places, they tend to differentially benefit low-skilled workers because of the sectoral allocation of the subsidies. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. Let me invite Rafael Nivin.
All right. Thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. I'm going to start by summarize the paper. And this paper is about heterogeneous regional and sectorial effects of credit subsidies on the level of credit, unemployment, and skill intensity. No? And this paper focused on two main areas. They have an empirical exercise that try to show evidence how a specific policy about subsidies in Brazil led to increased agricultural employment and result in a decrease in the skill intensity of the labor market affected by this policy. No? And in the theoretical part, this study show how local capital accumulation is influenced by regional tradability of goods, depending on the extent of which the target sector is used for investment production, and also for general equilibrium forces like migration and input-output linkages. And in this part, we can it's possible to see that subsidies can affect the skill intensity of local markets, depending on, very crucial, on the capital skill complementarity in the sectoral production function. Okay? My assessment of this paper in both parts, and the theoretical part and the empirical part. In the theoretical part, this framework is a very rich framework. It has a lot of details. It's a well-detailed model to try to measure the impact of these credit policies on local market and sectors. Oh, there's a dynamic spatial model which allows to identify the channels through which credit friction affect capital accumulation with sectoral and skill composition depending on these special linkages to trade, migration, and input-output linkages. No? The model allows to rationalize the effect of subsidies, how subsidies affect local labor markets to this capital skill complementarity. No? And also, there is a well-implemented empirical strategy to estimate the causal impact of credit subsidies within a particular region in Brazil. No? They exploit the fact that semi-arid boundary is not related to any administrative unit, and by that, since it's defined based on climatological conditions, so he can use that just to evaluate cities around these boundaries. And they show us in the paper that there is a clear increase in share of workers in the agricultural sector and a decrease in the ratio of high to low skilled workers with no effects on wage inequality. Oh, this is a very clear empirical estimations. And now I want to make some comments on this paper. The first comment that I would like to mention is that the paper consider that the credit spread in the model, the credit spread is mainly based on monitoring costs. And this is really puzzling me because there is previous evidence that bank competition is important for determining credit spread for Brazil, specifically for Brazil. So I would like to see what could be the implication. I know that in this model it will be very difficult to consider this kind of additional topic, but I would like to see what could be the implication of considering that market power or bank competition also determine the credit spread in this model. It will be interesting to see what could happen with the model. Another comment that I want to see to address for the model is that the model that try to explain the long-run consequences of credit policies make an important assumption that the composition between high-skilled and low-skilled workers are determined solely through migration. And it will be interesting to see, because this is a long-run model, to see how the result can change if we consider that within local labor markets, there could be an endogenous changes on labor skills as well. That could be interesting to see how the model can change with this addition. Okay, and for the empirical part, I would like to talk about two additional comments. First, there's also literature about Brazil about bank location choice, and that literature shows that a large share of municipalities without there's a large share of municipalities without banks, and that this location choice is endogenous as well, and depend of several factors like time variant characteristics such as city size, productivity, and that could determine the effectiveness of credit subsidies. So it will be interesting to incorporate controls related to the bank structure, such as the number of banks in a municipality, also the degree of bank concentration, loan per capita, some additional controls that can take into account this bank location choice. And also, there is a potential friction in the location of decisions. In location decisions, like, for example, informational externalities might explain the largest share of cities without banks, and banks could pay entry cost to acquire information, and that could also affect the result that you are having. The other is, it could be important that in the time span that you are implemented this empirical exercise, is that there could be additional shocks that should be taken into account. For example, early 90s, there was a trade liberalization process that has implication across industries and across sectors, and maybe controlling for industry and municipality specific exposure to trade could help to have a better specification of the empirical model. No? Other than that, I really like these papers, well written, very detailed, with a lot of details, and I would like to see more about it. Thank you.
Well, before Daniel can make his reply, is there any question from the audience? Yes.
Yes, so my question is about some possible contamination between the control group and the treatment, because the municipalities are so close to each other. So, you know, workers might move, and whether you can see that in your empirical specification.
Any other question? So,
Whoops. How do we turn it on?
I think.
Is it on?
Yeah, it
yes.
is on.
So let me start with the last question. So that's a common issue with these geographic regression discontinuity designs. It's an important channel. What we argue two things in the paper. So the first one is that sort of these mechanisms are taken into account in the model, and so we're using the empirical evidence to estimate part of the parameters of the model. And so if that's happening, that's also going to be in the model. The second important thing is that if your concern is specifically about credit going into controlled municipalities, in the sense that, you know, it could be the case that firms are going and obtaining credit in the other side of the boundary in order to invest in the non-treated municipality, that would be sort of biasing our results downwards. And so what we're seeing would be a lower bound to the overall effects, because in a way, credit would also be increasing in non-treated municipalities. So that being said, we could do more into seeing whether there's migration across these two, like sort of paired boundaries. That's a good suggestion, and we could definitely take a look.
Daniel, before you address the comments, I think there's another question.
When I look at your charts, most of the action comes in the last 10 years, 2000, 2010, that we decided to this commodity boom. I remember reading that in the Northeast, there was some technological advances that allowed for more production in arid lands. I wonder whether that could be contaminating the results, and is there a possibility to extend this for the following 10 years, 2010, 2020? When the plan is passed in the commodity boom, maybe the results could be interesting. And what will happen in what are the consequences of that?
So thank you very much for that question. I think that's a very good point. I would say that, you know, the specification that we have at the moment is very much comparing municipalities just across the border. And as we show in the paper, if you look at pre-treatment variables in 1980, there's really no differences between these municipalities once you really compare municipalities just across the border. And so it's likely that the commodities boom affects both sides of the border and not differentially one side of the border versus the other one. So I think we would be fine in that sense. That being said, in terms of following the following years, I think the data is not ready yet because the population census hasn't been given for analysis. That's a very good suggestion, and we could definitely do that once the data is available. So thank you. And then for Rafael's point, so I think the bank competition, I think it's a very important thing. Gustavo has a very nice paper actually thinking about this. In the paper, we have a footnote that says that doing this is very challenging in a dynamic spatial model. That being said, we are working on an extension that tries to really think about this and tries to take seriously the fact that these subsidies might be crowding out private credit. So that's a very good point. In terms of endogenous human capital accumulation, that's something super interesting. So there's two things in that side. We do a sample restriction in empirics to try to really only consider individuals that were in working age. And so we're not capturing any effects on endogenous human capital accumulation in the empirics. And so that's why we don't have it in the model. That being said, I think there's a very interesting thing to do in terms of future work, and that's something that we're thinking about in terms of the interaction between credit market frictions, endogenous human capital accumulation when you have capital high skill complementarity, because places that don't have credit, don't have capital, and also could affect endogenous human capital accumulation decisions in the long run. Bank location choice, control for bank structure. So we have municipality fixed effects. And so in that sense, if bank location is not changing, that should be captured. That being said, I think your point was towards endogenous change in bank market structure. The only thing that's kind of an endogenous variable, so it would be a bad control. What we could do is control for, the number of banks before treatment, and then interact that with time dummies to try to ease some of these concerns. So that's a very good point. And then finally, on the trade shocks, I think it's a similar thing related to the commodity boom. My answer would be similar in the sense that I don't think that it's going to differentially change across the boundary, given that we're really considering municipalities that are very close by. That being said, we can definitely control for tariffs interacted with industry shares in the period interacted with time dummies to see whether the results are robust to that. So I think that concludes it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Well, let's move to the last paper from Danielle on lending rate caps.
Okay, thank you again for inviting me for present this paper. This paper is a joint work with Carlos Burga, who is here in the room, and with Diego Yamunaque from the Central Bank of Peru, and the usual disclaimers applies. Okay. The motivation of this paper is that it's common in developing countries that small firms borrow at high interest rates. No? And that fact make that in some cases government try to push to implement this kind of policies to implement lending rate caps. And it will happen in many countries in the past few decades. No? And what we try to analyze is what are the consequences on this kind of credit policy in the credit markets, and what are the implications for financial stability. No? A priori, the effect of lending rate cap on credit is unclear. There is bank, according to bank market power, banks can take or can induce or can react to this policy, directing credit to more risky borrowers, for example. Also, given that mostly risky borrowers are subject to this high interest rate, once this interest rate cap is in place, these risky borrowers are going to be out of the credit market. No? And also for financial stability, the consequences are uncertain also. No? It's going to depend of how the banks react to these lending rate caps. No? And in that, this project, what is going to analyze is the effect of lending rate caps on credit and financial stability, using the context of the implementation of this kind of policy in Peru in 2021. Okay. In Peru, in July of 2021, there was implemented interest rate cap and set the interest rate for a small firm, for credit to a small firm, at 83.4%. Okay? And when we analyze the data related to this policy, we see that in the months previous to this policy, this interest rate cap is going to affect 27% of new loans and 6% of the value of the new loans in the stock of credit. And also, in order to comply with this policy, the interest rate payments that need to be reduced is about to 9%. Okay, and then we have this policy in place, and we want to analyze what are the effects on credit and financial stability, and we use difference in different approach to analyze this policy in different considering different level of analysis. No? The outline of our results is that considering a loan level effects using a treatment based on loan size, we have that there is a reduction in the interest rate after this policy, and a reduction of the value of credit to small firms of 9%, and there is a decrease in the number of small size loans of 8%. No? At the first level, what we have, if we consider only incumbent borrowers, we are going to show evidence that there is a firm within firm allocation. No? From small size credits, there is an allocation to an expansion to large size loans. No? And finally, at the city level, where we consider a treatment that is going to be the needed decreasing interest rate payments necessary to satisfy the loans. We can see that there is going to be, as a result, that a decrease in the interest rate for each standard deviation. There is going to be a 5 percentage point decrease in the interest rate, but there is going to be a null effect on the stock of credit to small firms. So this is consistent with the previous analysis, but what we are going to explore at the city level is the allocation that banks make across firms, industries, and cities. No? And we are going to see that bank credit move away of risky firms towards a safe and new clients, especially in concentrated cities and low-risk industries, which have interesting implications for financial stability. Okay. This paper is going to contribute to a large and growing literature about the implication of credit policies, and also within the literature about how about the relation between finance and development. No? Because this policy was mainly implemented to small firms. Okay, so just to summarize the data we use for this project, we have two main data sources. there is in order to comply with this policy, now financial institutions need to report the flow of credits where we can obtain data on interest rates, maturity, and the value of new loans. And that was important because we also have the credit register for Peru. That's a longer database, but we didn't have in that database information on interest rates and maturity, for example. No? So this is an interesting complementarity of these databases. All right, and what can we see about this, the distribution of loans according to the size? No? Most of the loans, most of the small size loans are given in at high interest rates. No, that's one of the key features of the credit to small firms in Peru. No, mainly the small size loans are given in to a high interest rate, and most of those loans are going to be affected for this interest rate cap. No? So we did a different analysis at the loan level, and we use as a treatment the size of these loans, and what we found as a result, and there is effectively this interest rate cap reduces the average interest rate for small firms. Okay, and also it reduces the amount of new loans for this credit to small firms. Okay, and also, okay, this is an aggregate result. There is a decrease in the interest rate, in the average interest rate, and there is a reduction in the amount of new loans. And we also analyzed what are the effects within firms, how the reduction and in a small size loans for the firms, how the firm or the firm can be able to replace those loans for example, larger loans. No? And in order to do that, we separate or we group these loans according to the size of the interest rate where these loans were given. No? We separate firms that borrow a high interest rate and firms that borrow at low interest rate. Okay? And we use that as a treatment. And what we found at the firm level is that there is a decrease also in the interest rate. That's consistent with the previous result. But what we see is that there is not there is a null effect on the total value of credit for firms. And we are considering only in this analysis the incumbent firms that has information before and after this policy was in place. So, and also we see that the share of small loans, small size loans decreased after this policy. So these are showing us some evidence that firms are able to replace small size loans with loans of the bigger size, because the net impact is there is no net impact, but there is a negative impact on the size, on the share of the small size loans. Now, when we analyze the impact of this policy at the city level, we are going to consider the possibility that there is additional channels to analyze in terms of the entry and exit of firms, reallocation of bank credit across industries and cities. No? And in order to do that, we are going to construct a treatment variable that is going to be the percentage decline in the interest rate payments necessary to satisfy the regulation. So how the debt service has to be decreased in order to comply with the interest rate cap. No? And we're going to build this treatment variable across across cities. No? And we can see for the graph that there is a lot of dispersion about how the cities are affected by this policy. No? Okay, so what kind of results we're going to have in this exercises? We see that there is, again, consistent with the previous result, there is a reduction in the interest rate, in the average interest rate across cities. But there is the effect on the on credit is not significant. No? So there is a decrease in the interest rate, but there is not an effect on the total credit. But we can analyze what happened in other this aggregate result, this null effect on in total credit is hiding some interesting and important features that we want to highlight now. For example, there is a decrease in the amount of non-performing loans, for example, and there is an increase in the amount of normal loans, and there is a decrease in the share of non-performing loans. No? So this has some implication for financial stability, because even though there is a null effect on aggregate credit, we are going to see that the amount of non-performing loans are decreasing, and the amount of normal loans are increasing. No? So there is a redirection of credit according to the riskiness of the borrowers. And also, we can analyze this effect taking into account the bank concentration. No? And we see that this change in the bank behavior according to the riskiness of the borrowers is due mainly in highly concentrated markets. In highly concentrated market, there is this effect that we were seeing in the aggregate, but when we consider, when we compare what happened with less concentrated markets, this effect is has a smaller magnitude, no? Or even null magnitude. And also, this effect is mostly relevant for industries with, or more risky industries, considering industries, the riskiness of the industry, or the industry when depending on the degree of the share of non-performing loans within each industry. No? And for high risk industries, this effect or this distribution of credit from non-performing loans to normal loan is stronger, no? Comparing with what happened with low-risk industries. Okay, so this distribution of credit across the type of borrowing, we want to explore more to see how specifically is this allocation of credit according to the riskiness of borrowers. And what we find is that since we've seen in the previous result, there's a decrease in the non-performing loans in all cities and industries, but normal loans normally increases only in concentrated markets and low-risk industry. No? What we're going to see now, what we're going to do now is to split this, the borrowers depending on the degree of riskiness and defining safe borrowers as borrowers that never experience more than 30 days of repayment in the previous year, in 2010, in the year previous to the implementation of this policy. And risky borrowers is going to be the firms that has more than 30 days of repayment delays, at least once in the previous years as well. And we're going to defend new borrowers to the firms that didn't have loans in the previous years. No? And using this composition, we see that only safe and new clients report a positive effect after this regulation, or once this regulation was in place, what we're going to see is that the loans to safe borrowers increases and new borrowers also increases, no? With no effect on the amount of loans to risky borrowers. No? And this happens in high concentrated cities and also in low-risk industries. Okay? And okay, to conclude, we in this paper show that lending rate caps can reduce interest rate with substantial allocation effect across firms. Within firms, we see that there is an allocation from a small size credit to large credits, and across firms and across film industries and cities, we see that credit move away from risky firms towards safe and new borrowers. No? And this effect happened more in concentrated cities and low-risk industries. No? So these are important implications for financial stability, because we can see that moving away from risky borrowers can be can have bank can have a better profile. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. Now let's hear Gustavo comments.
Okay, so thanks for everyone that stayed until the end. So those are my views, and again, not those of the Fed. So I'll be discussing this super interesting paper. So let me show you something that's not in the paper as my first slide, which is, this is an important question. So we're in Brazil, so I'm taking two examples here in Brazil. So in January 2020, like, we put this cap on overdraft fees, so like cheque especial here in Brazil. And this is not mine, I'm taking from like a newspaper op-ed from Bernardo Guimarães. It's an amazing piece. And I'm sorry that it is in Portuguese. So the blue line is showing individuals, the red line is showing firms. The left-hand side is quantities, the right-hand side is prices. So like, what are the overdraft fees, right? The kind of like change that was passed in Brazil was just for individuals. So what we see is, like, we see very clearly, not a lot of changes in quantities relative to firms, like this big decrease in prices. So it's a classic example of, you put this in, like why this stuff matters. And at the same time, kind of like recently, a couple of months ago in Brazil, there was this proposed change in the consignado, like this payroll loans that we saw on Wednesday. And what happened there was like completely the opposite, right? So banks said, no, we're not originating these loans. So in a sense, understanding kind of like lending rate caps matters, right? We have examples as the one on the top, and we have examples as the one on the bottom. So we really want to kind of like dive in and understand what's going on here. So summary of the paper is, just very quickly, it was this policy implemented in Peru. It was a cap on all loans. They find that there was kind of like this reduction in rates across the board, but at the firm and city levels, like pretty much no effect on quantities. So something that looks kind of like maybe a little bit more like the top. In here, the quantity increased for safer firms and regions with like a higher HHI. It's a credible design. It's very well executed. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a step back, and instead of talking about like details of the paper, I'm going to say like let's think through, if you think through a model of interest rate caps, what should you care about? So if you're a policymaker, what should you care about? Right, and I didn't do this only for this discussion, so I have this working paper and on lending rate caps. So the paper is entitled "Lending Rate Caps in Emerging Markets: Good for Growth." So just to give kind of like a very, very brief overview, we have a bunch of firms in the economy. They're heterogeneous in risk, but also in productivity. And typically, their lending rate is going to be something that is related to the markup. So how much the bank is pricing up, the risk of this firm, and then the marginal cost, which here I'm saying it's R. Firms demand more if it's cheaper. And the reason why we saw in the first slide that these interest rate caps tend to be have different effects is because it's a blunt instrument, right? You're applying one instrument, a cap, on the combination of markup and risk. So you're limiting the bank of how much they can be compensated for risk. At the same time, you're limiting how much they can be charging higher markups. So in some cases, depending on which one dominates, you're going to have different effects of interest rate caps. All right, so let's think through what should happen. So what I'm showing in here is, in the x-axis productivity, vertical axis is risk. So if banks can be fully compensated for risk, they don't care about it. They just charge higher rates. Firms that are going to take credit are those that have a higher, like above a threshold in productivity. So this is kind of like the pre-policy improvement. The post-policy is you put in a cap. What happens is the banks can no longer be compensated for risk. So they cut out the A piece there. So they cut out risky borrowers. There is this set of C borrowers that are not affected. Like they're just like well above the cap to begin with. And then you have these B borrowers. These guys are the ones that are going to be affected by the cap. And the reallocation that we're going to see in this economy is from A to B. So A is canceled out, B gets more loans. So what you should expect in here is R is going to come down as consistent with their data. Credit is flowing for safer firms as consistent with their data. The quantity in the model is ambiguous. And what they're going to show in their data is that this is pretty close to zero. So in the region A, you're losing credit. Region B, you're gaining credit. The net effect is you don't know. And they show in their application, it's pretty close to zero. All right, so that's kind of like the setup. So now it's, what should we care about, right? Like if I'm a policymaker, I look at the results, so kind of like, what would do that would maximize welfare? So we write this kind of like this model, and then it has kind of like general equilibrium, reallocation across firms, entry, exit, all of it. And then what we show is this kind of like very nice results that statically, so if I'm concerned about maximizing welfare or output today, what I care about is the sum of leverage. So how much credit do I have in the economy? But also the combination of leverage and productivity. So this is kind of like a misallocation term, right? So if we go back to like the previous plot, the question is, how many firms do we have that are high productivity and high risk, or that are actually kind of like low productivity and low risk, right? So this is the kind of question that is going to come up in the model. So what they're showing in here very convincingly is that the first term is zero. So there's not a lot of changes in quantities. But the key question is, what is going on? So the funds are flowing to safer firms. And the question is it's safer but more or less productive, right? Showing that there is no effect on quantities, it kind of like, it still leaves something else to be done. And I know I was talking to one of the authors that they don't have the data yet, but they will eventually. So I think that is like really what we're thinking about is both the combination of quantities and what is the allocation. One thing that is interesting to note is that you don't care about rates in the static trade-off. The rates are just a redistribution from banks to firms. So why do we actually care about the effect on rates? Is about the dynamic trade-off, right? So then we extend the paper to have transition and steady state. And the key thing is that lower rates allow firms to accumulate more capital. Firms tend to be financially constrained. And then what matters in there is who is more constrained? Is the firm that gets the extra capital, or is the bank that needs the extra capital to do more lending? So that's what's going to come out of it. So what we try to argue is that, you know, this effect of firms being financially constrained is pretty large, and you could have like the evidence from Ben Moll's kind of like AER paper, and actually like the effect of Q is small here. So banks will still like lend. These are pretty small firms, so it shouldn't affect bank equity that much, right? So in this case, it's always going to be optimal to have this binding kind of like cap. And the reason why it's going to be binding to have this cap is to allow firms to accumulate more capital. So we also want to see what is going on with this firm. How much more capital are they accumulating as a consequence of this policy? So if we're thinking about the effect of the policies, not only quantities, but also how much are they saving, quantities times prices in the future, how much more they're accumulating, and are the firms that are more constrained accumulating more, right? And just a small point in our calibration, we find that the optimal cap is around like 1.5 to 2 times the marginal cost of making a loan, which I would say 83% is likely like much higher than that still. Right, so I'll conclude. So it's a great paper. I think it's a very convincing, kind of like it's a very clear policy, but I still think that there's a lot of room to bring theory and empirics together in this kind of like in this literature. So we can think about alternative policies and then policy feedback, imposing constraints on banks and bank entry, exit, et cetera, in the economy.
Thank you. So before we move back to Rafael, is there any question from the audience? We have two in order of.
Very good presentation, a very nice policy study. Now, it really gets my attention that perhaps the policy kind of focused a lot on the extensive margin, but then I only saw a little part of a small, tiny fraction of the extensive margin analysis when you look at the incumbent. But then I was wondering, I'm very interested in knowing, well, first, what is the probability of exit, which is the other side of that story. And it's perhaps possible to calculate it because you have you know who's no longer there, and you have ex ante data on these guys. So it's possible to calculate some probability of exit and run these regressions. And I'll be very interested in knowing who are the exit guys, what happens to them. A very interesting avenue of analysis that are these exit guys riskier in very objective terms? For instance, over the last 5 years, did they default a lot? Because if this is the case, perhaps you have a very interesting result in which you found a way of putting an end to some zombie lending practice. Also, you show us responses in non-performing loans, but do we also have responses in the level of provisions? Because again, if these things don't really go hands in hands, perhaps you also put an end in some evergreening. So it would be very interesting to know if this relationship between NPL and the provisions isn't changing, because there might be even more interesting stories in the exit group. Not that the story is very cool as it is, the paper is very interesting as it is, but the exit part may be very interesting to also explore. Thank you very much and congratulations on the nice work.
Thank you. Yes.
Very nice paper. So I was a bit surprised with the result of interest rates going down, and I was curious just to hear your thoughts about how able are you to capture with your data other fees that banks might be charging to the borrowers besides the interest rate, and how are they changing? I have some work in Brazil that we found, we just said that it's around, that when banks give an earmarked loan to a firm, many times when the firm is risky, they do this when they can give another loan that is not capped at higher interest rates, no? So kind of not to lose.
Thank you. Yeah, one more question.
Yeah, so as far as the within firm results, if I understood correctly, firms are able to shift towards bigger loans, away from smaller loans that are subject to the cap. So they go away of the cap, out of the cap, but they still suffer a decrease in interest rates, even not subject to the cap. Is that what I got? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. The floor is yours.
Okay. I'm going to start with the last one. No, actually, they cannot go away of the cap. They just redirect or change small size loans that at that time it was with the interest rate above the cap for larger loans, no? And that's one way to do it. The other is that for example, that recomposition within a firm could be maybe due to because small size loans are subject to more administrative costs, that if you give it at a larger loan, maybe the administrative cost is smaller. No? But in any case, the new loans has to comply with the cap. Okay? There's no possibility to be above the cap now. And what the others, this is discussion of how the banks can replace what they get for the interest rate with some other charges that the bank can make. That's the normal, or that in other studies I analyze that happen very often. But in Peru, before this cap, there were already some measures to make sure that the additional charge that the banks do have to be very justified. No? And previously, in previous year, the banks wanted to make some extra charges for some reason, and the regulator stopped that and forbid to do that. So when we go to this situation with interest rate cap, the banks didn't have much room for doing that. And that's why we argue that maybe it happened through a distribution of how to provide the credit, but not specifically to charge more with additional extra charges. Okay. And for the first one, the analysis of the extensive margin. That's a very good suggestion. We could consider those two, and the relationship, how the relationship between non-performing loans and provision. That's a very good point that we want to take it. And now with the comments of Gustavo, very nice theoretical framework that we for sure going to analyze and include in the paper. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Rafael. Well, thank you for all the three panelists here. I think this is a very important policy discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us. Just, I would like to let you know that please, you need to go to the bigger hall to have a closing ceremony. And don't worry, because in Brazil, there is a strong correlation between the time that you have lunch, and your net income. So we are in good shape, okay? So have a good afternoon. Thank you.